Hello everyone and welcome to today's livecast. I'm so happy to be with you tonight. It's been a long while since we last met here, about 2 weeks ago. These 2 weeks seem to be very long. We think we need to do something about it. Karibu sana. Let me know if you can hear me loud and clear before I proceed. Someone please confirm if you can get me loud and clear. Karibuni sana. Please let me know if you can get me loud and clear. Thank you, Lillian, for that confirmation. Karibu sana. Extend this invitation to your friends as well so that we keep learning together. And I should be starting in the next 2 minutes. Please pass the link to your friends. Thank you, Lillian, for your kind words. I can clearly see. We should be starting in the next 1 minute. I want to believe we all have our pens and papers or empty minds so that we can continue talking about these realities in the way that they need to be talked about. As usual, please extend the invitation to your friends. Share the link. We are now counting seconds. All right, I think we can start. So good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me once again tonight. It's been a long 2 weeks since we the last YouTube live session here. And I remember last month, while talking about borrowing blunders, we agreed that we were to talk about purpose-driven borrowing. That was before there emerged great demand for the topic of personal budgeting, practical personal budgeting 2 weeks ago. So tonight we are here to to talk about purpose-driven borrowing. Purpose-driven borrowing. You know, the reality about the money life is that we will never talk about money entirely. We will never say we have concluded the conversation of money if we will not talk about debt. And I have said many times that debt is here to stay, that we have never gotten a large enough forum on planet Earth to be adequate for us to stand and declare debt null and void. So debt is here to stay. Debt is going to be with us for a long, long time. We found it here and we will leave it here. So that means then that the best we can do is for us to master how it works, be able to understand how it works, and be able to, if need be, use it as a catalyst for wealth creation. I have said many times that all of us have been in debt before, one way or the other. And while many people view debt as their biggest enemy, as the monster in the house, the truth is that the monster in the house is something else that is worse than debt. Debt itself is not bad entirely, is not bad absolutely. Each one of us gets the chance to define our debt as either good or bad by our conduct before, during, and after borrowing. So we have the choice, we have the chance to give our debt the definition that we want it to take. Unfortunately, very many of us are not conscious as we relate with it to give it the we get ourselves here. And a lot of times, as we ask ourselves how we got ourselves where we are today, where we are burning our fingers today, in many cases, it's a little bit late. And a lot of things have happened, things that may not be very pleasant at the time we are asking ourselves that particular question. Emily Ishmael, I can see you. Ruth G, I can see you. Thank you very much for your kind words. Even as we reflect on this serious conversation. So the question that constantly would emerge every time when people get trapped in debt, every time when people start struggling with debt, is the question of, how did I find myself here? How did I get here? And a lot of times we do not have answers to that particular question because it has happened to us as a shock. We have found ourselves in a spot that is not very comfortable, a spot that does not look very familiar, and it's a painful spot. That is the time we're asking ourselves, how did we get ourselves here? Now, the answer to the question of how did we get ourselves here lies in the answer to the question, why did you get yourself in debt? In other words, I'm trying to say that the quality of your life after incurring debt is dependent on the quality of the reason that got you into it. So, and this is a principle of life, that we will perform in whatever it is as best as the reason that got us in that thing is. So if you have a weak reason, you find yourself not sustaining yourself in whatever you are trying to do. The reason, the push behind you're doing what you will be doing is what will sustain you in what you will be doing, and is what will determine how fruitful you become in that which you will be doing. So the purpose for doing anything ultimately defines the fruits, the results, the outcome of whatever it is that you find yourself doing. So the same case applies to debt. The reason that pushed you into debt will define how far you will go in terms of using the debt to either benefit you or cause you a lot of trouble. So as you ask yourself, how did you find yourself there? Be quick to also remember to ask yourself, why did I borrow in the first place? Because that reason is what will determine a lot of things. Now, behind every borrowing is always a reason, is always a purpose. You know, purpose is simply the reason for doing something, the reason for something. So behind every borrowing there is always a reason. There is always a purpose. That which pushed you to approach your lender, that which pushed you to pick your phone from your pocket and dial those digits, that which pushed you to download that app and begin to see whether you can be able to access credit. That is the purpose. Now, it is interesting that in the world of debt, we much as we will always have purposes for borrowing, it is also a reality that some of these purposes will be hilarious, while others will be very serious. You know, there are those reasons that if somebody told you, I have borrowed for this reason, you will almost want to laugh. But there are some reasons, if you listen to, you want to appreciate that this person sounds like a serious person, that this person seems to be doing to be knowing what they are doing. I have shared this example before, of long ago while still serving at the bank. I remember someone who used to come for salary advance every other month. And his reason for the salary advance used to be a very hilarious reason, because this guy used to say that he was going to treat his sick cow. I know some of you will remember that example, that he was going to treat his sick cow, and he would come every other month with the same reason, but he didn't realize that I was marking his reasons. So 6 months down the line, on his sixth borrowing, I take him aside and I tell him, boss, I think to do you justice, rather for you to do justice to yourself, I think it's high time that we let this cow of yours to die. And the guy appeared shocked. And I tell him that you've been treating this cow every other month. And the guy tries to deny, only for me to show him a pile of application forms for the past 6 months, all of them indicating that he was going to treat his sick cow. Now that reason sounds a bit hilarious. Now we have other serious reasons. There are people who will go to borrow and they will quote reasons like they want to go and invest, they want to go and do a construction, they want to go and do things that sound serious. Now, some purposes are also easy to say than others. Some purposes can be easily expressed than others. There are reasons for borrowing that even if you wanted to say, you try opening your mouth and your mouth refuses to open because they cannot easily be said. Maybe because of an illegality. Maybe they're not legal. Whatever you want to do with the money is not legal. And so you're afraid that if you mentioned exactly why you want to make that particular borrowing, maybe you will be denied credit. Maybe it is because in your own judgment, you already know that that reason does not look or sound like a serious reason. And so you don't want to say it. Maybe because it sounds shameful. So there are reasons that you may not be able to express. You may not be able to easily state, to easily say, especially in front of people. And so when you go applying for a loan, for example, from a bank or whatever institution, and they ask you for the reason for your borrowing, at the back of your mind, you know that if you said this reason, you will either be ashamed or it's not legal or it contradicts the terms and conditions for which this lender can agree to lend. So what happens in such a case where you really need the money, but the reason refuses to come out? The reason cannot be easily expressed. How do you go about it? How do you get to convince the lender to give you money? And human beings have not fallen short of creativity when it comes to this particular element, because I have a feeling that we sat in a meeting somewhere as borrowers who had reasons that could not be easily expressed, and we asked ourselves, so what are we going to do so that the lenders can give us money? What are we going to do so that we can be able to access this money, yet we have the reasons that cannot easily be given out? And I have a feeling we sat in a meeting somewhere and we cracked this out and we found solutions, because human beings have been very, very creative. And that is how I realized that many borrowers, rather, we will have two sets of purposes for which we will borrow. We have a purpose that I call the disclosed purpose. And then we have a purpose that I call the non-disclosed purpose, or the undisclosed purpose. Now, the disclosed purpose is the purpose that you easily disclose to the lender. In many cases, the disclosed purpose is that purpose that will make the lender feel like lending money to you. In many cases, it is the purpose that you feel that if you disclosed, you will whip the lender's emotions into lending you money. It is that purpose that you know if you stated, then it will conform with the lender's list of lending purposes. So that is the disclosed purpose. Then we have the undisclosed purpose. Now, we have now those people who have a reason that cannot easily be expressed, but they still want to borrow. So at the end of the day, we end up having about three categories of borrowers. Now, the first category, which is the ideal category, is the category of those borrowers who only have one purpose, and that purpose is the disclosed purpose. In other words, they know why they want to borrow, and they are free to communicate why they want to borrow. So when they approach a lender, they go straight to the point and say, I am looking for this amount of money to do 1, 2, 3 things. And that is the only reason for which they make that particular borrowing. And when they get the money, they go straight into doing that which they purposed to do from the word go. Now that is the ideal position. The second category are those that will have one disclosed reason, but after the money has reached into has gotten into their hands, then they end up spending the borrowed money on other emerging needs or wants. The moment money is given to them, they start having voices behind them, convincing them that there is another more urgent reason, that there is another need calling for the same money than what you intended to do with the money. They begin to divert borrowed funds. Those of you who've been here for a while, you've heard me talk about the dangers of diverting borrowed funds. There's actually a video in this channel that speaks to the dangers of diverting borrowed funds. I think it is video, by the way, number 24, talking about the danger of diverting borrowed funds. Find it if you missed it at your free time, and just get to see how dangerous it is for both individual borrowers and business borrowers. Then the third category are those who have both sets of purposes. They have the disclosed purpose, and then they have the undisclosed purpose. So they will approach the lender with the disclosable purpose. They will tell the lender that they're coming to borrow for investment. They're coming to borrow for school fees. They're coming to borrow for home improvement. They will talk about reasons that seem to make sense, especially to the lender. However, at the back of their minds, they know that they are borrowing for another reason that is not disclosable. So they have the two sets of reasons. Now, once they have access to the money, then they spend the money on the reason that was not disclosed. And in this case, that is the original reason that took them to the lender's office, that took them to borrow, the undisclosed purpose. So those are the three categories of borrowers. Those that will stick to one, they borrow for it and they spend on it. Those that will have one, they borrow for it, but they divert the borrowed funds. And then thirdly, those that will have both, the undisclosed reason and the disclosed reason. So they will disclose a reason that is appealing to the lender, a reason that they know if they stated it, the lender will give them the money. But once they get the money, they end up spending on the reason that could not be easily expressed. Nonetheless, reality remains that your performance in Your interaction with debt will be dependent on the purpose that pushed you into borrowing. Good reasons will sustain you, will make you feel happy that you borrowed. Bad reasons in the long run will find you trapped in debt and will leave you with regrets as to why you actually borrowed. Good reasons will add value to you. Bad reasons will drain value from you. Good reasons will add money to your pocket. Bad reasons will take away money from you. So as you go about your borrowing, it is important to establish the reason behind your borrowing and whether it is a powerful reason or a weak reason. Now, it is important to recognize that largely we have two drives, two forces that push people into borrowing. People are driven by different forces, and largely these forces are two forces that push them into borrowing. Now, the first force is ability to borrow. And that is why I say we have borrowers that I call ability-driven borrowers. Ability-driven borrowers. The second drive, the second push is purpose. And that is why we have what I call purpose-driven borrowers. And those are the borrowers I seek to see at the end of this session. But let me talk about ability-driven borrowers. Majority of the borrowers today are ability-driven borrowers. These are borrowers who borrow simply because they qualify to borrow. These are borrowers who borrow simply because there is a willing lender. Just because someone came and said that they are willing to give them money, then they quickly ask for the paperwork and they sign and they take the money. These are borrowers who will borrow just because they've been told that they can qualify for a loan. You know, this is how you tell an ability-driven borrower from a purpose-driven borrower. When an ability-driven borrower approaches a lender, let's say they have gone to the bank to borrow, ability-driven borrowers will flash out their payslip if they are employed, and the first question they ask the lender is, check for me how much I can qualify. Then they will be told 200,000, nipatie form. 500,000, nipatie form. 1 million, nipatie form. So I'm left wondering, what exactly took you to the lender? Did you really have a reason behind your borrowing? How come you are ready to take up any amount that you are told you qualify? Now, in many cases, ability-driven borrowers will take up the full amount they qualify. If they are told they qualify for 1 million, chances are very high that they will complete forms asking for 1 million. They will complete forms for the entire amount. You know, the message you're communicating is that you actually have no reason that is pushing you into borrowing. You're simply borrowing because you qualify, or you have a crowd of reasons at the back of your mind, reasons that you have not filtered through to figure out what exactly you need to do. You've not prioritized the reasons that are crowding your mind. So you simply borrow because at the back of your mind, you feel like you have enough reasons that warrant your borrowing. That is ability-driven borrowing. Now, it's a dangerous form of borrowing because a lot of times, this drive is what drives people into the trap of debt. Because when you borrow for a reason that you have not qualified, then chances are very high that you'll have money in your hands, money that you have not given names to, money that you have not assigned a reason to. And that is very dangerous. There is nothing as dangerous as money in the hands of someone who did not have a reason for that particular money. I have said here that the average human mind will generate needs for money in about 10 minutes. That means that if I left you with 100,000, In 10 minutes, you will tell me how you want to use the money. If I balloon the amount to 1 million, you will still need 10 minutes to tell me roughly how you will use the money. So when you borrow and you have not defined why you want to borrow, chances are very high that you will immediately come up with a reason as to why you want to borrow. You will immediately tell me how you will utilize that money. And now, in many cases, we end up using the money for reasons that are not urgent, for reasons that are not very important. And that is where the danger lies with ability driven borrowing. Now, beyond ability driven borrowing, we have purpose driven borrowing. And that is the category I want to invite all of us to tonight. Purpose driven borrowing. That if you must borrow, then you need to ensure that you borrow in a manner that will leave you better off, in a manner that will not leave you with regrets in future. You need to borrow in such a way that will demonstrate that you knew why you were borrowing. You were clear on why exactly you needed to borrow, and then you end up using the borrowed funds for the reason that you intended, because it is a reason that you have determined to be a superior reason, to be an important reason. Purpose driven borrowing. Now, purpose driven borrowing dictates that every borrowing decision rather needs to emanate from the purpose of your borrowing. That the purpose of your borrowing should dictate every decision that you will make around your borrowing. Now, for many cases, as I've mentioned, that is not usually the case. We simply complete forms to borrow simply because we qualify. But now here, I'm introducing a different thing. I'm beginning to say that the choice of where you will borrow should come from the purpose of your borrowing. That the choice of the amount that you will take should come from the purpose of your borrowing. That the choice of the kind of debt that you will take should come from the purpose of your borrowing. That is ability driven borrowing. So, my work tonight here is to share with us the process of purpose driven borrowing. It is a 5-step process that I determined would be useful for those of us who have determined that we must borrow, because it is not a must for you to borrow. It's not a must for you to be in debt. It's not a must for you to have a loan. Contrary to what many will tell you, that mwanaume ni deni, that you can't do without debt. The truth is, you can make a choice to do without it. But when you determine that you need to do it, then there is a process that if you followed, then you minimize the chances of burning your fingers in future. You minimize the chances of encountering trouble in the days to come. So allow me to share with us the 5 steps of purpose-driven borrowing. Now, the first step of purpose-driven borrowing is the step I call purpose qualification. Purpose qualification. That before you approach a lender, you must qualify the reason for your borrowing. You must take the reason for your borrowing through some qualitative analysis. You must determine whether it is a fit reason for borrowing, whether it is a reason that makes sense for borrowing. You will not just borrow because you needed to borrow. You will not just borrow because someone was willing to give you money. You will borrow because the reason for your borrowing is a reason that looks like a reason that makes sense. Now, at the purpose qualification stage, this is where the conversation begins. And this conversation is largely in your mind. This is the point where you have started convincing yourself that you need to borrow. This is the point where you have conceived the idea that you could actually use debt as part of the solution to the problem at hand. So what happens at this stage is that you begin to ask yourself qualitative questions. You begin to ask yourself, is the reason for my borrowing a legal reason? Is the reason for my borrowing a reason that will add value to me? In the long run, when I look back after borrowing, will I regret that I borrowed, or will I be happy with myself that I borrowed? A reason that when I look back, I can tangibly see the fruits for that particular borrowing? Or is it a reason that is coming to take away value from me? Those are questions that you're asking yourself at that particular point. You also ask yourself, can this purpose wait? Right? Must it be fulfilled now? You're also asking yourself, can it be fulfilled using different means? Is it a must that I borrow? Because as I've said many times, the debt, so that means before you get yourself into it, you want to be keen and determined that that what you want to do with your debt is something that will be worth the process of borrowing. So you're asking yourself, can it be financed by other means? Can it wait for me to accumulate money through other means? Can it wait until I earn my money? Now, if I must borrow, must it be now? You are qualifying the purpose of your borrowing. You are trying to see whether that purpose makes sense. You are asking yourself at this point, who am I borrowing for? Where am I drawing the inspiration for my borrowing? Last time when we were talking about borrowing blunders, I mentioned the blunder of borrowing for other people, of wanting to copy other people's lifestyles and pasting in your own. And I mentioned of you seeing me with a beautiful phone, but because you don't have the money, tomorrow you go to borrow so that you can buy a similar phone or a better one in a bid to compare yourself with me or to outdo me with regard to my phone. So I mentioned that if you did that, and the following day you come and you realize that I have bought another phone that is more superior, then you begin to feel bad that you have not done or achieved what you sought to achieve. It is because you didn't borrow for yourself, you borrowed for me. So at the point of purpose qualification, you are asking yourself, am I borrowing for myself? Or I'm borrowing for a different person? Am I trying to copy someone else's life? Or am I trying to be original in the reason for my borrowing? That is the stage of purpose qualification. You are trying to make sure that you have a good reason for your borrowing. So that is step one. Now, step two, after you have determined that it is actually apparent for you to borrow, after you have determined that indeed you are convinced that for you to solve the problem that you currently have, then you need to borrow. Then you move yourself to the second step. And the second step is the step of purpose quantification. So the first step was qualification. The second step is the step of quantification. Now, in this second step, you now begin to put values on your purpose for borrowing. You have determined that you need to borrow and you need to borrow now. Now you put figures to it. In this stage, you are asking yourself, what is the worth of this purpose? How much does this purpose require for it to be fulfilled? So you determine that this purpose requires 200,000, for instance. Then you also ask yourself, what do I have in my hands towards the same purpose? Or are you the kind of borrower who is just looking for someone to finance 100% of whatever you wanted to do? Do you have a stake in it? Do you have something? Have you saved towards that particular purpose? How much do you have in your hand towards that particular purpose? So maybe you determine that you have 20,000 in your hand towards that particular purpose. Then you ask yourself, so what exactly do I need to borrow? How much do I need to borrow to make sure that this thing happens? Now, this particular third question begins to prevent you from borrowing every amount that the lender will give you. every amount that will be told you qualify for. This particular third question begins to safeguard you, because you now get a clearer position of exactly how much is the deficit that you need to address for you to be able to achieve the purpose that you seek to achieve. So if your purpose was for 200,000 shillings, and you have determined that in your hand you have 20,000 towards the same purpose, then it means that you have a deficit of 180,000 shillings. Now that is the value for which you need to seek debt. So that means then that as you go to borrow, you are not going to borrow blindly. You are not going to borrow any amount that they will tell you that you qualify. You will walk into a lender's office with a lot of confidence. You know, sometimes I feel bad when I see people walk in a banking hall with a lot of, in a manner to suggest that they are apologizing for being in the bank. The people walk into the bank as if they're doing the bank some favor. People walk into the bank like they're walking into some sacred space. People will be tiptoeing, and they are keen. They don't want to even drop a pen. They're walking as if they're making a mistake in the first place. How I wish that we recognized that we are actually doing business with the bank. We are actually the reason as to why the bank is existing. How I wish we realize that we have a lot of power as we walk into the bank. How I wish we realize that the bank is waiting for us, that the bank opened its doors because they were praying so hard that you showed up. Now, when you are armed with a clear purpose, whose value you know, then you will walk with a lot of confidence in the lender's office, and you will sit down and clearly tell the lender that I have this purpose and I need funds of this amount to be able to accomplish this particular purpose. That way, the lender looks at you and knows that this is someone who knows what they are doing. That way, you exude some confidence whose levels begin to show that you are a serious person. You are a person who is clear of what they want to do. Now, when you approach them with the value of your borrowing clear with you, even if they told you that you qualify for $1 million, remember, the bank is in the business of lending. So on the ideal side, the bank wants to lend you as much as possible. So that means then the bank will be very happy to give you the maximum you qualify for. But remember, you may not be needing the maximum amount you qualify for. So knowing the value of your purpose will safeguard you when the lender will try to persuade you to borrow a huge amount. Because many times after calculations, you said you wanted 200,000, the lender will be telling you, yeah, we can see you can actually qualify for 800,000. And you see, we can spread this so that you can repay this loan at flexible repayments per month. If you're not careful, if you are not clear how much you needed, you may begin to warm up to the idea that they give you more money. But remember, you've not qualified the purpose for the more money that you will be borrowing for. Your reason was for a smaller amount. Now, at the purpose qualification, or rather quantification stage, is the stage where we avoid a lot, because the truth is, once you get that money, it will be utilized. That money will be used. That money will get finished. But there is nothing as bad as the money is finished, and that is the time you start asking yourself, why exactly did I get myself into this? I wish I just took the money that I needed, because that was the money that was going to add value to me at that particular point. So avoid borrowing just because you qualify, just because someone is willing to give you a particular amount. And the truth is that many lenders actually know that many borrowers have the weakness of being ability-driven borrowers. And that is why they will be luring you into taking the maximum amount. That is why they keep sending you SMSs telling you that you now qualify for a top-up. That is why the mobile apps will be sending you messages telling you that your limit has been enhanced, that your limit has been grown to this particular figure or the other, because they know that a vast majority of us will not resist the temptation when they are told that they qualify for that particular limit. Tonight, I invite you to be a higher person. I invite you to be this person who begins to nurture their financial discipline, who is able to say no when no is due, who is able to say that this can wait because I have not determined that I need to take this money just because they've told me that I qualify for it. I dream for that day when you will walk with all those apps texting you and telling you that you have that ability, but you smile, look at them and tell them, thank you for the information. The day I will need you, I will come. But for now, let me be. That is the person I'm inviting you to become tonight. So that is the third stage, purpose, rather the second stage, purpose quantification stage. The third stage of purpose-driven borrowing is the stage I call the purpose classification stage. So now you have quantified that the value for your purpose is this much, that you're actually looking for 200,000, for instance, for you to be able to execute, for you to be able to implement the purpose that was pushing you into borrowing. The third stage that you move to is the stage of classifying your purpose. Now, this is the stage where you begin to gauge the urgency of your purpose, the nature of your purpose. How urgent is it? Is it a purpose that needs to be sorted immediately? Is it a purpose that needs to wait for a while? What is the actualization duration of this purpose? How long will it take for the purpose to be fully accomplished? For example, if you determined that you needed to borrow because someone is sick and you need money to get drugs for them, for instance, and someone else who needs to borrow to construct a house or to purchase a house, you realize that the one who is borrowing for medication needs the money now. And once he gets the money and buys the medicine, the purpose is achieved. But the one who is constructing the house, it takes a longer time for that particular purpose to be actualized. So you must determine the nature of your purpose. Is it a purpose that is urgent? Is it a purpose that can wait? When exactly do you need to actualize that particular purpose? Now, the reason as to why you must ask yourself that question is because that particular answer will drive you into knowing the kind of debt that you need to look for. So you must know the nature of your need, the nature of your purpose, especially with regard to time. Because it will lender's office to begin pushing for debt that will take weeks for the money to be ready. That means you will get the money when the reason, and that means then you will face the danger that I mentioned of determining the use for the money in 10 minutes. And in many cases, those will not be reasons fit enough for borrowing. So you must determine the nature of your purpose. You must be able to tell yourself that you are borrowing for the right reason, and this particular reason time for it to be actualized. So that is purpose classification, where is it a short-term purpose? Is it a one purpose? Is it a recurrent purpose? Is it a purpose why you have to classify it? We have different categories of debts. Every debt is not just debt. You know, I know many times when we are under pressure looking for money, debt appears to be the same. We will stop at nothing until we get the money we want, regardless of the source of the debt, regardless of the cost of the debt, regardless of any other consideration, because our eyes are fixed on the amount. But tonight I remind us that debt is not just debt. Debt is classified. Now, different people will classify debt differently. We will have others talk of secured debt versus non-secured debt. We will have others talk of classified debt in terms of time, and this is the classification I want us to reflect on. And we will have short-term debt, we will have medium-term debt, and we will have long-term debt. There is a greater consensus that this is debt whose repayment period goes up to 1 year. Some scholars and other contributors have said it can go up to 3 years. But my aim for telling you this is not for you to cram the time that it takes. This is not an academic conversation. This is a common sense conversation. I'm simply bringing to your knowledge that there is short-term debt, and this is debt that is repaid within a shorter period of time. Now, there is medium-term debt, and this is debt largely that spans beyond 1 year up to about 5 years. Then we have long-term debt that is repaid beyond 5 years. And this is where we begin to talk about mortgages and things like those. Now, you have to realize that your purpose for borrowing, because if you don't, then there will be a mismatch. There will be a mismatch between your reason for borrowing and the kind of debt that you will go to borrow. And that takes us to the fourth step in purpose-driven borrowing. And the fourth step, you now classify the types of debts that are available. Because debt comes classified, at this fourth stage, we begin to match the right kind of debt for the right nature of the purpose. And then we marry the two, and then we need to borrow. For instance, short-term debt comes to us that will erupt when we least expect, and they find us flat-footed. That is what short-term debt was meant for, to address urgent needs that find us without money. In many cases, emergencies. It would be hilarious for you to go for short-term debt when you are looking at constructing a house that will take you months to be completed, yet the money you have borrowed will be needed after 30 days. So that will give you a lot of pressure even before you complete the project for which you went to borrow. It will be hilarious, for example, if your need was for food. You needed money to buy food, but then you went to the bank and began processing a full payslip loan, which will take a week or two to be ready for you to buy a packet of unga for your family. I doubt whether they'll still be alive waiting for the disbursement of that particular money. But where does the danger come in? The danger comes in here. Every time you make that mismatch, every time you pin the wrong source, the wrong nature of debt to the wrong reason, to the wrong purpose, then you are setting yourself for trouble. Chances are high that you will find yourself paying a lot of interest on a borrowing that you ought not to have paid such kind of interest. By their nature, short-term debts are expensive. Short-term debts, I'm talking about overdrafts, I'm talking about salary advance, I'm talking about these mobile app loans. They are short-term in nature, but the truth is, by their nature, they are expensive. You know, we rarely look at the cost, but when you are given money at 15% per month, multiply 15% times 12, then you begin to see how that rate looks when it is annualized. Then you begin to see how expensive they are. So if you borrow a short-term debt to execute a reason that is long-term in nature, like you're trying to construct a house, the house is still very far from completion, and you take a salary advance that needs to be repaid in 1 month's time for you to buy a bag of cement. And then after 30 days, they need their money, but the house is not complete. It would be different if You've constructed, the house is almost complete. You've gotten to the level of saying, I need to move into that house so that I stop paying rent. And if you determine that the only thing that is keeping you from moving in is made by window panes for you to move in. But where the construction is far from completion, and you take as an advance that needs to be repaid after 30 days, you're creating room for a lot of unnecessary pressure after 30 days when that money is deducted from you. Then again, you also begin to reduce the risk of having idle funds. In the example that I mentioned, if you have a sick person and you need the money today, and you go to process a loan that will be secured by a piece of land, that well. So the question of funds, idle money in your hands. And having idle money, I have said, is a very dangerous thing. It's a thing to be avoided at all cost. So when you do the right matching, you reduce the risk of finding yourself with money whose reason has actually either expired or money whose reason cannot now be fulfilled. Yeah, because unnecessarily, because if you needed a packet of unga, long term or medium term in nature, they will have a minimum amount. So you go to a lender and the lender tells you that the minimum amount we can give you is 50,000, but you are only looking for a packet of unga. Actually, you only needed 200 shillings. You had better off done with asking for help from a friend than approaching your bank to process a loan whose minimum amount applicable is 50,000. So once you get the 50,000 and you buy yourself a packet of unga, or packets of unga worth 500 shillings, where are you going to share of your purpose and the type of borrowing? So the fourth stage is where you must find good mapping. You must be able to map properly between the two, so that then you reduce the chances of burning your fingers in the days to come. So after you have done all that, after you have taken yourself through those 4 stages, you begin to realize and the nature of what you need. You have determined the type of debt that will address that particular need. Now you move out, you now get out and begin to source for lenders. Now you have to scout for lenders. Previously, when we spoke about borrowing blunders, I mentioned it is important to take time to compare lenders. And I shared different parameters upon which we can compare our lenders so that we pick the best lender available. Make sure that you are also conscious of the cost of borrowing. Cheap is expensive, I keep saying, except debt. So if you must borrow, then go for the cheapest. There is no explanation under the sun for you to borrow at 30% when there is another willing lender under the same terms and conditions willing to give you at 15%. Take time to compare your lenders. Take time to look at the terms and conditions upon which they are willing to give you money. Then settle on a lender that best meets you at your point of need. So the 5th stage is the stage where you're stepping out to execute the borrowing. You are going for the lender that you are looking for. You are going out to do the actual borrowing. You're looking for the lender who understands the need that you have, who understands the purpose that you have, the lender who is willing to meet you at that particular point of need. Before I finish, in the next couple of minutes, let me briefly say something about a purpose that we frequently mention in many borrowing instances, and that is something we call emergencies. Very many people cite emergencies as their purpose for borrowing, even when they know that. Let me remind us tonight that in the definition of an emergency is a very critical word, and that word is the word unforeseen. So emergencies are unforeseen circumstances. That means any other thing that was foreseen ceases to be an emergency, stops being an emergency. So any reason that you borrow for that you were able to foresee, for instance, when we take our children to school, it is not rocket science. It does not require many determinations for us to know that when schools open, school fees will be needed. Forget about what is happening today, because COVID has thrown a lot of things out of control. But in the normal situation, when we have our children in school, we already know that when schools will open, school fees will be needed. So that is already foreseen. When we rent a house, we already know that at the end of the month, rent will fall due. So that is foreseen. So when we borrow for school fees, we should always remind ourselves that this is not an emergency. We created it. I don't know any other better way to say it. When we borrow for rent, we must remind ourselves not take care of something somewhere. That should be seen. And these days, even those that are unforeseen can also be mitigated. Why we begin to talk about things like medicine, so that in the event that they happen, then we are at a better position. We reduce the chances for us to be needed to borrow at that particular point. Good people, I want to believe that I have shared something that will lift you from where you are today to a different position. I want to believe that should you choose to relate with debt in the days to come, then you will deliberately choose to be a purpose-driven borrower and not an ability-driven borrower. That you will, because you have determined that you are actually adding value to your life. I want to thank you all for joining me tonight. I want to wish you well in the days to come until we meet here again. May God bless you abundantly. May you have a pleasant night. May you be protected of the Lord until we meet again in 2 weeks' time. Thank you so much. For those that have not subscribed, please, before you leave, press the subscription button. There are so many videos here that you can interact with that can also influence a thing or two in the way you handle money and the way you handle life entirely. Be free to invite your friends so that next time we also can learn together. Thank you so much, and God bless you all.